I think the thing that's important to remember for educators is that every interaction you have with a student is an intervention.
That's Maria Munro-Schuster, licensed clinical professional counselor and author of The Empathetic Classroom. Teachers often say, I'm not trained to be a therapist. But what if supporting student mental health doesn't require becoming one? How can educators and parents use developmentally appropriate therapeutic principles in everyday moments? And how does understanding our own reactivity help us show up more calmly and consistently? I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. A conversation with Maria Munro-Schuster is ahead on episode 303.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
If you're a mental health clinician who works with clients with ADHD, you've probably seen this pattern. Clients who are constantly busy, exhausted, and yet somehow still stuck. Lots of motion, very little traction. They reorganize, they research, they plan and prepare, but the task that actually matters never quite gets touched. What looks like motivation on the outside can actually be avoidance dressed up as productivity. And when we don't name that clearly, clients might leave therapy feeling like they're trying everything and still failing. That's one of the reasons I'm excited about an upcoming CE training on ADHD and productivity that digs into concepts like fake productivity, dreaded tasks, and perfectionism, not as character flaws, but as predictable mental barriers. Dr. Ari Tuckman is joining me for this APA and NBCC-approved 1.5-hour continuing education training on Friday, February 6th. And if you register before February 2nd, you'll also receive an early bird bonus of a clinician-ready set of tools, maps, and client handouts that you can use right away to help clients move from insight to follow-through. If you'd like to know more, head on over to neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes to sign up. My conversation with Maria is next.
on a recent episode of the Neurodiversity Podcast.
One of the core and very tragic findings that we have found with the BGALS study, the Berkeley Girls with ADHD longitudinal study, by their teen years and early adult years, these girls, compared to a matched neurotypical comparison group, are at very high risk for self-injury, cutting, burning, so-called non-suicidal self-injury, and also frank suicide attempts. Girls may tend to internalize the negative feedback and the stigma, and with no one to talk to about it and feeling ashamed of their condition, they may not even know they have a condition called ADHD. We have to figure out the kinds of early interventions, and we've got some good evidence-based interventions that can prevent this very self-destructive course.
That's episode 278, Girls and ADHD. Find it on your favorite podcast platform.
Today, I'm talking with Maria Munro-Schuster, a licensed clinical professional counselor and former K-12 and university teacher who spent more than a decade in the classroom before moving into mental health work. She now practices in Bozeman, Montana at Mango Beetle Counseling, where she blends her background in teaching, writing, and psychology. Her new book, The Empathetic Classroom, helps educators and parents understand their own nervous system patterns, set healthy boundaries, and create emotionally safe, human-centered environments for kids. Her work bridges therapeutic insight with real classroom experience, offering practical tools that support student well-being while also caring for the adults who show up for them every day. So, Maria, I'm so happy to talk to you today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. I feel like I'm in a room with a very like-minded individual. It feels good.
You use the phrase mental health mindset, and I really like that because it shifts us from thinking about isolated strategies to thinking about a way of being with young people. And so for anyone who really kind of might be a little bit new to that concept, both educators and parents, how do you define a mental health mindset? And how does understanding our own nervous system patterns fit into that, especially compared to the more traditional manage behavior and move on approach that so many of us grew up with?
Yeah, that's a really great question. From the very beginning of doing this work, of wanting to share with educators what I learned as a counselor. I realized that really the things that needed to shift in classroom dynamics between this relationship between students and teachers was less about sort of doing more things, or even less about having a curriculum that teaches certain things, and more so about the educator embodying certain ideas that are taught in psychotherapy and in counseling programs that are all about just how you show up in the world. And the wonderful thing is you don't have to change who you are in order to show up with a mental health mindset. I think a lot of adults sometimes maybe fear, and especially like sometimes if we're really like passionate or funny or, have quirks to us, incorporating emotional sort of concepts into ourselves. The idea of a mental health mindset is embracing our quirks, but maybe learning how to pull back at times to allow space for others, and feeling just really into ourselves enough so that we're regulated and responding authentically to whatever appears into our environment. So we're not looking for perfection of behavior. We're saying the right thing. We're saying embrace your genuine self. But when things go awry in relationships, as they do, here's ways that you can approach them differently within yourself. And so a mental health mindset is learning how to, really acknowledge what's really coming up within you when something happens. Maybe it's anger, maybe it's irritation, maybe shame, and then knowing what to do with that when it appears so that it doesn't impact our relationships in a less helpful way.
What you're really talking about here is the concept of counter-transference. And as therapists, we're really trained specifically in our programs of study to understand this impact of counter-transference, which is basically the way our own histories and emotional patterns really shift our reactions. But one of the things I've come to realize is like as educators or as parents, like we don't get the language for this, even though we're constantly navigating emotionally charged moments with kids all day long. So for someone who might not have really heard or understood that term, what would you add to that explanation about counter-transference? And what shifts when we do start to recognize those emotional responses as part of our own story rather than something the child is causing or doing?
Right. So I want to maybe start with just acknowledging that, when we experience moments of counter-transference, it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong necessarily, right?
Absolutely.
We're not a bad teacher, person, parent, therapist, student. When we interact with others, we oftentimes have experiences of ourself show up when somebody does something that speaks to maybe our own history. I think about, meeting with teachers and talking about their nervous system. Like some of the things that will come up will be, I become angry when a student lies to me. And oftentimes I think we feel like it's the student's behavior that is the problem. And really what I ask the adult to do, or the person in power, this could be a manager even within a company, right? This doesn't have to just be a teacher. I ask them to, rather than just immediately assign blame to the other, take a moment and really look inside of yourself and say, what in my history, what pattern do I have here that has to do with lying? What was lying about in my own household? And I've had some people tell me things like, I wasn't triggered by, nobody was allowed to lie in our household. So nobody lied to me. So I don't know how that could be a trigger. And I say, well, if you weren't allowed to lie, that could mean that lying is a threat to your nervous system when somebody does something that you felt like you were never allowed to do. So let's look at lying from a different angle. So I might ask them then to step back and consider what need might be trying to get met through a student lying to you. And then there's more steps involved in taking care of our own nervous system in that moment. But that idea of countertransference is really just recognizing that our histories, our stories show up we see them in other people, and then we take them on, or we put them on them as if it was our own.
The example I sometimes use is like, if something that a student does in the classroom reminds me of my sister or my friend or something, and maybe that's a fraught relationship, how does that then influence how I react towards that person? I mean, that's essentially all it is. It's just recognizing that we all come to every situation, every environment, every relationship with our own stuff. We could call it baggage if you want, but I feel like that has a negative connotation. It's just lived experience. That's all it is.
Sure.
But if we're unaware of that, it then can influence how we interact with the others around us.
It's incredible, really, when you think about how much in a day's time, especially educators, but anybody who works with a lot of people, how many different individuals we encounter in situations and sensory stimuli. And our nervous system is reacting to all of this. Like I really do like Stephen Porges' term neuroception, the idea that our nervous system is reading cues from the environments that we're in, the people we're seeing, long before our brain interprets what's going on. And our nervous system is oftentimes where the reaction is coming from, rather than having this long planned response to different things that are happening. And educators in particular, can be prone to, and I've been there myself, reactionary responses to things, because it oftentimes feels like there's not a lot of time. We're feeling under pressure in a lot of ways, and overstimulated oftentimes in classrooms.
Every educator has that moment. There's always this one minute where a student says or does something that hits a nerve that we didn't even maybe know was there. I'm curious if there was a time when one of your own emotional triggers surfaced when you were teaching, and how becoming aware of your nervous system's reaction shifted your mindset or method in that moment.
I think that I, especially doing my work in a counseling program, lots of time to reflect on all the things that went wrong, and also learning to offer compassion to myself for those times and moments that things weren't done perfectly. I think of a example that stands out to my mind. Oftentimes the ones that affected me the most were the ones where students disconnected from me after the experience, and I felt that disconnection. And so I think about a time teaching middle school when I was ready for maybe a more relaxed Friday morning, and came in with this very relaxed sort of energy probably, and you encounter middle schoolers on a Friday morning and they are excited. So I'm like adult going into like relax into the weekend mode, and they're super pumped about the weekend. And I now can look back and see that disconnect in our alignment or attunement with each other. And on top of it, I had a student who had not prepped me for what their presentation involved that morning, and I had asked them to. And they brought the world's largest, like hamburger patty-sized sugar skulls in for every single student. And they were beautiful. And at the same time, I thought, I cannot be responsible for them eating these sugar skulls and then sending them into the rest of their classes for the day. And so I asked in my most, calm demeanor if they could please hold off until the end of the day to start munching on the sugar skulls. In the moment I was saying it, a student took a giant bite out of the sugar skull, and then the whole class just started eating them ravenously. Now I look back and I think it's kind of funny. I now can look back and say, okay, so my nervous system in that moment felt like it wasn't heard. And sometimes teachers use the term disrespect. Like I felt disrespected in that moment. But I think when I look deeper, I go, something within me wasn't heard and they didn't care. And when I take that back to my child self and I think about not being heard and somebody not caring, I can feel a wellspring of emotions come up around not feeling maybe heard or understood as a young person. And so here I am in my adult body sitting there having that same reaction coming up within me. So that moment was not really seen by my students. But then as I was taking them down the hall, like outside for a break or back into the classroom, they were extremely loud and bouncing off the walls. And the other teachers were looking out their doors like, what is going on? And I lost it in that moment. And I took them outside and I gave them a lecture about not being so loud. And one student was just in shock about where this strong reprimand was coming from. And that student didn't talk to me for a long time. Like there was almost fear there with somebody who I had a really, what felt like a well-connected relationship. And so I can now see, looking back on that experience, how I could have addressed it differently. And I could have even said, I don't have to say it's okay to, be as loud as you want and not listen to me, but also maybe I could have grounded myself a little bit more, spoken more even-toned. And if I did yell, even coming back and saying, hey, I'm sorry that I yelled. I really, that's not the response I wanted from myself that day. Are you willing to accept that apology today? And so it's interesting now feeling more comfortable with that repair work. But as a teacher, just trying to figure every day out and survive, that repair work felt difficult at times and uncomfortable, even just acknowledging where I went wrong.
Yeah. It requires a level of vulnerability to kind of accept some of that. When we talk about mental health in the classroom, there are so many teachers, when I work with educators, and they'll say, well, I'm not trained to be a therapist, or I'm not trained to be a counselor. And that's true. They're not. However, they're often using a lot of therapeutic skills without even realizing it. And, at the same time, we're navigating those kids' emotions in real time and without much warning, and certainly without the luxury of planning for those moments. Sometimes when I hear teachers make that comment, like, I'm not trained to be a counselor, I kind of in my own mind think, well, but you are kind of a first responder. Like you are kind of there on the scene throughout the day. So how do you think about weaving developmentally appropriate therapeutic principles into everyday classroom life in a way that feels really doable for teachers? And how might those same practices support or even mirror what parents are trying to do at home without making anyone feel like they're stepping into a whole new professional role?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I would say even my own concern of hearing that as an educator, if somebody said, you are kind of playing counselor, I think at the time I would have said, well, I don't feel trained. And there may be some people that would more naturally lean into that type of work or not. And so the approach that I take now, having been in that educator role and now sitting in kind of more of that mental health space, is to really clearly define for educators, what is their role in mental health in schools. And the three terms that have been kind of well identified now for those roles are teachers are promoters of mental health, they're collaborators with other mental health professionals and students and families, and they offer support. So promoting, collaborating, and supporting. The good thing to remember is that you're not offering treatment. There's never a goal of interaction with student in which you're seeking to heal anybody's wounds of any sort. And some people, I think, sometimes feel like they want to do that. And I also stress not stepping into that territory. I think there's a lot of natural healing that can come out of just really great quality relationship skills without having to step into more serious sort of intervention territory that maybe a counselor or a therapist would use. And so I think the thing that's important to remember for educators is that every interaction you have with a student is an intervention. So this is the piece that I have really wanted to get into sharing with teachers, is that the training with for the counselor is in how to be in relationship with another human. And it's subtle. It's not necessarily very noticeable. And I think that that's kind of the That's where the really sweet spot is you're not doing anything big or grand or special. It's really tuning into what's going on inside of yourself as you're teaching throughout the day. And it's learning how to step back from moments and take on the observer role. It's taking yourself out of that kind of center of attention or center of control. And I think as an educator myself who wanted things to go right, oftentimes in classrooms, that was really hard to do. And there's fear sometimes if I let go of that control, maybe all chaos will break out. But I think really getting to know the individual personalities within your classroom and their different nervous system and sensory needs is really the key to having a great learning experience. And that also means then readjusting your expectations for every day because of all the pressures we can have as educators, it's so easy to feel like we have to do everything in a day. And I think that's where the fear of taking on sort of emotional or mental health needs meets resistance sometimes in schools is like, I've already got enough on my plate. And what I'm inviting is more of a way of looking at, this is about you showing up in maybe your more genuine self in a school setting so that you feel like you can get through a school day as an educator as well. This isn't just about averting crisis with your students. That's oftentimes where the focus of mental health work, that's where a lot of the resources go. And I suggest it's about the mundane interactions, who's shutting down and when, and what's going on when they're shutting down. Who's got lots of energy during the day and what's going on there as well. And I think that observation and then that processing and reflection work we can do as educators can be really interesting and can actually enhance our teaching rather than feeling like it's a extra burden. Mm-hmm. And so I say, let's take, little controversial, but maybe let's take SEL off the table as like content. Let's take sort of relationships off the table as content that's something to be taught, and let's just get into them and let's model and work through maybe difficult things sometimes. I think my best years teaching were when I let go of that desire to be perfect as a teacher, brought my humanity into the classroom, and invited my students to do the same. Mm-hmm. But I had to really do a lot of reflection work before I got to that point.
Yeah. I think with a lot of these things, sometimes what people hear when you start talking about relationships and you're talking about empathy is they feel like they shouldn't set boundaries. And the flip side of that also is like sometimes there are people who worry that setting boundaries will somehow make them less empathetic, like that somehow those two things are not aligned with each other, when really I feel like the two are more meant to support each other. How do you think about the relationship between empathy and boundaries in your work? And how can that combination actually protect the emotional well-being of both the child and the adult?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And boundaries are all the rage these days. We talk about them a lot and we still don't know how to do them very well. And working as a counselor now, I think I hear a lot of people's maybe more inner dialogue, at least the ones they're willing to share with me about these thoughts on boundaries. And so you're spot on in that there's this sense of if I'm too boundary oriented, I'm cold-hearted. If I don't have, I don't want to have boundaries because I want to show that I care about my students. And so we kind of fall into these maybe stereotypical traps sometimes with boundaries. And I think the hardest thing about having a boundary for those of us who maybe aren't as comfortable setting them is that they feel rigid and they feel like they remind us of something from our own past that maybe felt like too many boundaries. Or, I usually say like we kind of go the opposite sometimes of how we were raised sometimes. Like I had too many boundaries, so now I'm not going to have boundaries and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So when we have to put a boundary in place, but we're uncomfortable with it, I think it feels like we're disconnecting from another person, like we're putting something in place that's like a barrier, and playing with that idea a little bit more. And just, with clients, I say, well, let's try just start, setting a small boundary, and I want you to be aware of what's happening inside of you? Are you, and even in your body, are you sweating when you're having to set a boundary? Does your voice get softer? What's happening for you when that occurs? And then just see what happens. Set one, practice it, see what happens. And I think oftentimes we're so afraid that people may not, everyone's looking for approval when it comes down to it, right? Even as educators, we want that belonging, that approval from our students, even if we already are in a position of power.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that fear of, having a boundary is like, maybe I'll lose that. And oftentimes people will respond differently to a boundary than you expect. And I'd say be open to that, because you will have students or children who will not like that boundary. And it was a boundary that was important to you. And so how do you not use that outcome and make a judgment then and say, okay, well, I'm not going to set any more boundaries because my students didn't like this when I set a boundary.
Right.
So I use the term in my book, and maybe people use other words too, but I think either sort of flexible boundaries as this idea of like, how can I actively sort of choose when I want to use a boundary, and when am I using a boundary more so as like a coping mechanism to either kind of keep people at a distance or to bring them in? And what's the purpose of that? So again, it goes back to less biological reaction, less using just that biology to set a boundary, and more so making a choice around a boundary and knowing yourself too. I know my own counselor gave me feedback when I started counseling. He said, I think you need to work on being a little bit more flexible with your boundaries rather than more rigid. And so having someone who cares about you even reflect some of that can be helpful sometimes, because it's hard to see ourselves clearly sometimes when it comes to these things. And we're just used to what makes us feel good. And sometimes lots of boundaries helps us feel good.
Helps us feel safe.
Yeah. And regulated. And I, always advocate for it's okay to get a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, like push that edge of out of that comfort zone into something slightly uncomfortable and see what it's like, and then come back to comfort again when you need to.
I like that. And I think the idea of flexible boundaries just means that in any given moment, you have the opportunity to check in with yourself and see, how can I adapt this? How can I modify this? I mean, we're talking about it within the context of kids, but I think that's just all relationships in general, and trying to find that place that feels right. One of the challenges that shows up as well, though, when we ask teachers, parents, whatever, to show up with empathy or patience or attunement, is that we don't always give them the tools and the time and the support to do that consistently. So thinking specifically about schools and building environments, what do you think are the things that get in the way of being able to implement these things, of being truly trauma-informed? And what do you think would help move the needle in a meaningful way?
That's a deep question. The lofty answer is I've felt like for a while now that fear is probably the major barrier to a lot of change in schools, especially when it comes to, any type of change. But, when we're talking about mental health or well-being or things that are internal, those are things that are not easily seen, and they're not easily quantifiable. And we exist in a school system in a country right now where there's still a good amount of like wanting to quantify, wanting to measure, wanting to have clear and easy boxes to check. And when it comes to each of our own individual version of well-being, that's not so easily measurable. Oftentimes when I feel pushback from students or families, even students who I see now, as a counselor, who are kind of along the lines of like, well, internal introspection is kind of silly. Like, I don't want to go there. Our society doesn't always place value on that. And thankfully, there's a slight needle changing and moving there. But a big barrier, is still our focus on academic standards. While those are important and good, they can be balanced, I think, a little bit more with recognizing human needs that occur within school systems. I look at all the ways in which, as educators and as students, we have to turn our bodies off in order to go to school in a day. And I see individuals now in my practice who are both educators and students who are saying, I don't want to go to school. I don't feel good when I'm there. I'm overstimulated when I'm there. And so if we don't start with attending to the basic physical needs that each of our bodies have, we can't learn. I mean, and that's just something we understand about the brain now. So it's hard to focus on learning when, maybe you're not going to the bathroom because you're afraid of leaving the classroom because of what will happen if you do, and all of those different things. So the barriers are still very much, I think, things that are beyond people's grasp and reach because they're administrative. They're oftentimes structural, systematic things. But I think when you're at the sort of the ground level in schools and talking to students and talking to parents and talking to families, people are wanting more and better quality relationships within schools. And regardless of even political ideology, a lot of parents say, I want my student to be seen for who they are. And I want people to listen to my student. And everybody, I think wants to just feel like they have a reason for being there and that it's a purposeful place to be. And there's just a lot of shuffling of humans that go around in school systems right now. And so lots of barriers. And I think the hardest thing about what so many of us in education and mental health feel right now is that it can feel so beyond our grasp to make those changes. And so, we're not going to be able to change the biggest things, but we can start by changing ourselves and how we want to show up in a school day and what we want our classrooms to feel like and, where we want to place priority in a day. And that shift can be subtle, and it can also still include having, academic goals and standards and all of those things. But I think just knowing what's important to you as an educator is really important.
Yeah.
And sometimes the answer to that might surprise you if you really sit with it. And sometimes it's important to even reassess if education is the place for you if something feels off.
It's a hard balance to strike, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So, Maria, I've really enjoyed our conversation today. As we wrap up, I have one last question for you. If you were talking directly to an educator or even a parent or maybe even a clinician who's trying to adjust how they are supporting the young people in their lives, what is it that you would really want them to hear?
I would say allow yourself to maybe just get out of the way a little bit more and let that person show you who they are, and be willing to be more observant rather than sort of do more talking or inquiring. So much of human experience is expressed through actions. And so even asking, how are you feeling, can feel invasive to a child. While we as adults feel like this is an important thing to know how to identify or understand, and we want to show that we're caring. But I think just backing away sometimes and really allowing a person to express themselves is really important. I see a lot of kids in my practice who are so overwhelmed by being told all day long what to do, and then they get in their parent's car at the end of the day and the parent asks a bunch of questions about the day and they're extra overwhelmed, and then they're totally shut down by the time they get home. And so that would be my biggest piece of advice, is give your young person space and see what they're willing to bring up when you give them that kind of space.
Maria Munro-Schuster, author of The Empathetic Classroom. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Emily.
I hope everyone listening can take this message with them today. Struggling doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It often means you're overloaded or dysregulated or trying to meet impossible expectations in very human bodies. A mental health mindset is not about being calm all the time or getting it right in every moment. It's about noticing, repairing, and circling back when things go sideways. So when a day is hard, let that be information, not judgment. Small moments of awareness and care add up, and they matter way more than perfection ever could. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Maria Munro-Schuster. We have more information about Maria and her work in our show notes. A quick reminder for therapists, register now for the continuing education course called Get It Done, How to Help Clients with ADHD and Others Improve Productivity. There's a link in the show notes. Register by February 2nd for a free set of clinical tools that will come in handy for ADHD clients as well. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.